Welcome to our sermon time. We've been walking through the Sermon on the Mount. Again, not so much to learn any kind of traditional religion, but things are so brutal politically in our country that I think the great spiritual teachings are a way of remembering the depths of our own heart and how we can live in joy and peace even in hard times. So last week, a couple weeks ago, we looked at anger and how that can lead us out of our own heart. We looked at how desire can lead us out of our own heart. Those aren't bad things, but if we want to live in joy and wisdom, it takes a real craft, a real art. So today we're looking at how language can kind of take off and have a life of its own. Right now, our nation is so divided, and it's deeper than just disagreement. It's like we have two different worldviews, two different vocabularies. And when I look at a place like Portland, I see the mayor standing behind a fence, getting tear gassed, supposedly to protect federal buildings. And yet the troops or these militia, whatever they are, no identification. For all we know, the president could have hired mercenaries. This may be Blackwater. We don't know. We don't know. And so when I look at this, I think of relief that Black lives are finally being discussed and honored and lifted up. But other people look at it, and as soon as a person picks up a stone, that disqualifies the whole conversation. And so instead of talking about how to make Black lives safer, we're talking about vandalism, these kinds of things that are really a separate issue. So, half of us go to Fox News to get our vocabulary, our worldview, our interpretation. The other half goes to MSNBC. And it seems like reactivity is becoming more and more pronounced. So I think whoever we are, from whatever position we begin, that we have to get back to our own humanity, to our own heart, to our own values, and not just react to the terrible things that are happening. So we know that, but we can forget that. Today we're looking at what seems like a very obscure text. Jesus says, you've heard it said, not to swear falsely, but I tell you, don't swear at all. Now, we have to realize that what's happening here you've heard it said, but I say, Jesus isn't leaving Judaism. He's going more deeply and profoundly into his faith. We must never forget that Jesus was born and died Jewish. So even though we are not Jewish, we don't need to dishonor that great religion. Jesus is saying that the heart of Judaism is mystical and universal. He wasn't the only rabbi to say that. So as we take up Christianity, we have to have that same kind of reframing. Jesus exaggerates in this section. You have to think of almost like a Zen master speaking to us, because what he's doing is saying, you've heard it said, don't kill. I say, don't even get angry. Well, that's impossible, right? But what Jesus is trying to do is get deeper than the law, to the intent of the law, the principles of dignity and virtue, and to realize that love is always at the heart of it. Now today he's talking about the nature of speech and how speech goes on autopilot. And sometimes our most religious and pious language takes us the furthest from our heart. I recognize this in myself from time to time. Every time I begin a sermon now, during this time of social distancing, I have trouble not starting with good morning, which it could be. I have no idea what time of the day it is for you, or night. But that's that kind of autopilot. I discovered years ago, I was doing a debate. I was defending reproductive rights, and then the other person was on the other side of that issue. And what I realized is neither one of us was really talking to the other one, right? We had no hope of communication. Instead, I was talking to pro-choice people and giving the talking points of a pro-choice person, and he was talking on the other side of the aisle and giving those talking points. So there was really no chance of communication taking place. Jesus is going to warn us then about the kind of theatrical language that takes us away from true communication. A great example of that in my life was when comedies first started on television. There was a thing called the laugh tracks, and if you've forgotten what that sounds like this. Let's see. So when you'd have a comedy, you'd hear that in the back, and it just didn't feel right. You knew that wasn't real human response to it. Although I've thought about adding a laugh track to my sermons, I think, or like applause or something like that. It's understandable, that kind of awkward silence. But when we fill that with kind of auto speech, we have to realize that there's a problem. Now, one of the ways that this passage gets misinterpreted a lot is that they, instead of swearing in the sense that the Jewish people meant, which was to take an oath, in the American sense, a lot of people say don't swear means don't say bad words. If you stub your toe, think of another word to say than the first one that comes to mind. And that there's nothing about that in this passage. I mean, that can be a problem too. But that's not what Jesus is talking about. Jesus is talking about authenticity. So sometimes swearing is a lot closer to what Jesus is talking about here. He says, let your yes be yes, your no be no. To be as authentic as you possibly can. And sometimes that's very awkward and very painful. I, from time to time, have tried not to swear like that, but I always get more frustrated. I always sound like, is it Ned Flanders on The Simpsons, where he goes, now wait one ding dong diddly moment. And it just, to me, that's like, it makes me more frustrated to try to do that. What Jesus is saying, and they've done research on the brain and found out that swear words are some of the deepest memories that we have. They're some of the deepest implants we have in our brain because they're coming from so deep within our wiring. And they've also done polls that said, or studies that said that people who swear tend to be trusted more. That you at least assume they're being authentic. That may or may not be true. But I think the heart of what Jesus is trying to remind us here is that the purpose of language is to communicate. And we can swear in a way that's not really communicating. We can call people names in a way that is not communicating. Again, I've found myself from time to time going autopilot, and sometimes being politically correct can keep this kind of conversation from happening as well. That I can learn the language of anti-racism. But if I'm not authentically dealing with what I really experience inside, I may not be as helpful. I may just be having a really polite mask to cover up. So it's what Jesus is talking about is working with the raw energies of the heart. And one of my favorite phrases that I've ever heard, sayings that I ever heard, Paula Poundstone was on a radio show, one time a talk show, and somebody starts ridiculing her because of something that she had said. And she said something I found very profound. She said, if I'm ignorant, don't ridicule me, teach me. And I think that insight. I mean, for me, that was really important. I've tried to remember that at least when I can, when somebody's acting completely inappropriately, to realize that's a teachable moment. That when somebody's just kind of swinging wildly, to help them realize they've lost touch with their own heart. Sometimes the more careful we are about language and getting that part right, the further we get from what we really think and feel. So when Jesus is saying, you've heard it said, don't take oaths falsely, don't swear falsely. I'm saying don't swear at all. He's exaggerating to make a point that our language can become mindless and heartless. And sometimes the better we are at it, the further we are from authenticity. I loved a joke that Steve Martin said. He had an oath for nonconformists. He said, let's repeat the nonconformist's oath. I promise to be different. Some people promise. I promise to be unique. Unique. I promise not to repeat things other people say. Then he says, good. And that'd be good for a laugh track to come in there. But I won't do that. So I need to think about this. This may be a great addition to the service. I'll have trouble getting it through staff, but so to realize that promises and oaths and carefully crafted speech is a step away from authenticity. I don't think Jesus is trying to say don't ever do that. But for example, think how much pain could be avoided if people didn't think that the marriage vow was all they had to do to have a lifetime of happiness. That vow, as beautiful as it may be, as moving as it may be, means very little over the years. What means something over the years is remembering your yes that you've said to the other person. And that's what Jesus is calling us to. The philosopher Santayana said, George Santayana said, that oaths are the fossils of piety. And I think to realize that sometimes our best speech is fossilized communication. It's not communication here and now. It doesn't have the molten lava quality. It's become frozen and fossilized. And this is an insight you see around the world. I love a passage from the Tao Te Ching, and I'll probably use it a couple of times a year, where Lao Tzu says, when the great Tao, the great way, is forgotten, goodness and piety appear. When the body's intelligence declines, cleverness and knowledge appear. Step forth, he said. Cleverness and knowledge, step forth. When there is no peace in the family, filial piety begins. That's sort of like family values. When the country falls into chaos, patriotism is born. And this is something to remember when we've lost contact with our own heart, and we're lost in this speech, and we're polarized, and we can't talk anymore, and we're living in these sound bites. Jesus is saying the way back to our own heart is to remember our yes and to remember our no. That our yes politically begins as a passionate commitment to human rights, but we can forget that and become reactive to oppression, to the extent that we forget that we're coming out of compassion, we're coming out of concern, and we care as much about people on the other side as we do the people on our own side. And we need to remember our no. We need to remember where we cannot cross over to make friends and to make peace. That no friendship is worth racism, sexism, living in our hearts. So it's that balance between the yes and the no that is our way out of the current political crises. And it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be painless. And I have no idea where the bus is headed. But I think what Jesus is saying is our response, the path that we need to walk, is not unknown. It's there in our hearts. And when we see this storm around us, we see this confusion around us, Jesus is saying, even in times of abusiveness, that what the world needs is for us to be teachers. To not sink into ridicule and reactive language, not to use high pious speech, but to come from our hearts. And again, finally, the way to our hearts is to remember our yes and to remember our no. Well, I invite you to your own thoughts on this, and we would love for you to make comments. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? It'd be great to have a communal conversation. If you're watching this on Facebook or YouTube, what do you think? What would you add to this? So again, take care, stay safe, go in peace.